Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. Today we're going to speak about European energy politics, and I'm interested in two sides of that. Firstly, I'm interested in political side in terms of international relations, and the second part will be about the book, which we will present with my guest today, who is Dr. Marco Siddi. Marco, welcome.
Thank you.
Marco Siddi is a researcher at Finnish Institute of International Affairs, specializing in EU-Russia relations and European energy policy. He holds adjunct professor positions at the University of Helsinki and Tampere University. Dr. Siddi earned his PhD from the University of Edinburgh and Cologne, focusing on the EU's external actions. His research covers energy and climate politics, identity politics in Europe, European security, and Italy's role in the European Union. There are two publications I would like to mention. First one was published in 2023. It's European Energy Politics, the Green Transition and the EU-Russia Energy Relations. And the second publication is European Identities and Foreign Policy, Discourses on Russia, published in 2020. So I'm very happy that Dr. Siddi accepted the invitation to our talk show. And let's start with the first round of the questions. So what I want to do, I want to understand the differences between the realist, liberalist or neoliberal and constructivist positions on energy security, on energy politics. So let's start with the realist theories in international relations and account for the energy security and the pursuit of energy resources as a key driver of state behavior in today's global landscape.
Yes, so realist ideas are coming back big time, I would say, in the debates, particularly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If we want to put it in a nutshell, the realists theorize the so-called energy weapon. So the idea that energy is a tool in the hands of a state to obtain strategic objectives. And so especially if you are a state that owns plenty of energy endowments, then you can use those resources, steer your trades, and leverage on world markets in order to achieve your foreign policy goals. Now, these ideas were not so popular until recently, as I suggested, because before we had a predominant neoliberal or liberal, if you want, approach, post-independence and so on. Now it's very much the case with, of course, Russia's gas and oil exports, but the debate is even expanding. The realist, let's say, logic is applied more and more also to issues such as China's control of critical minerals for the energy transition and green technologies. Of course, this is the Western perspective. The Russian and Chinese perspective would be that the European Union, for example, is using its market to influence energy flows, and China would rather focus on how the US, for example, is using sanctions and tariffs to curb its growth also in the green sector.
I wanted to ask you, when we speak about energy as a weapon, can this be also turned upside down or around? And can the states which are buying energy use buying energy as a weapon against states who export the energy?
This is definitely a possibility. The concept of energy weapon is very broad and vague. It can be criticized in many ways, but we can have this reading, and this is definitely what the European Union did after February 2022. The attempt of depriving the Russian state of revenues from energy sales. Of course, the logic was that these sales would go to finance the war in Ukraine. So depriving Russia of these revenues by excluding it progressively and from its main export markets.
And can we say a share of realist scholars in energy politics? For instance, when you have the global discussions, are those scholars mostly realist or they are liberals or constructivists?
Now it's, I would say it's the heyday of new realists again. So the idea of weaponizing energy. But for 30 years, at least, from the end of the Cold War until the early 2020s, liberals had the upper hand. So the logic that, growing interdependence, energy flows would prevent conflict. This was the rationale also behind increasing energy relations with Russia, building interconnections, pipelines, and also having asset swaps. So you sell something to Gazprom in Europe, and the Russian side allows you to acquire a stake in a production field, for example. This was all part of the liberal logic. In the mid-2010s, this logic started to be challenged. So two energy scholars, well, especially Andreas Koltau, started talking about, with Nick Sitter, started talking about the EU as a liberal actor in a realist world. Then in 2022, the realist world sort of took over and influenced EU decision-making quite radically. So we are experiencing quite a change in rationale for the European energy markets.
There is the third camp, and that's quite popular nowadays, and that's constructivist perspective. So they use norms, ideas, identities that influence states' action and decisions in energy politics. So what is that perspective about? And maybe you can mention some updates that our students and international audience might appreciate.
So as you rightly pointed out, constructivists focus on issues such as ideas, identities. What does this mean? It means that, for example, a country's history and so the way national identities, so the key ideas about the nations were formed, influence the country's foreign policy. So, for example, if we take EU-Russia relations as an example, for 3 decades and partly still today, we see that some member states have different views of Russia from others and of Russian energy flows. So for a long time, the Poles and the Baltics were much more critical of importing energy from Russia, even while they kept doing it themselves to an extent, whereas the Germans were much more positive about it. And this relates to historical experiences, of course, also to market factors, but historical experiences played a role. The idea of the Russian energy weapon, which we discussed, which can also be seen from a constructivist perspective, as an interpretation of Russia's energy power. This idea was much more popular in East Central Europe, and especially in the Baltics and Poland before 2022. Whereas for the Germans, these energy flows were an opportunity, and not just an economic opportunity, but also a way of pursuing rapprochement. So this German idea of Wandel durch Handel, so the change through trade, which informed projects like Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2. It wasn't just about economic gains. German diplomats really believed that, for example, German reunification, the rapprochement with post-Soviet Russia had been possible thanks to this kind of diplomacy. They were so-called Diplomaten der Wirtschaft, so the diplomats of the economy.
Right. What about geopolitics? Now everyone is talking about geopolitics. How geopolitics and that concept suits into energy politics and energy policies?
Again, so geopolitics is another very broad concept. Actually, especially for students, it's a good idea to check when it's interchangeable with international relations. And when it's interchangeable, we can also stick to international relations after all. But geopolitics itself is often associated with geopolitical competition. So competition for the control of resources. The basic definition of geopolitics is about territory, essentially. Then there are some other articulations. For example, geoeconomics is a related concept, which is about essentially control of especially economic resources within a territory. So this plays a role in the energy field because, of course, natural endowments are essential in the energy market.
Many students, they use energy transition as a concept or as a words in essays, and some of them, they're not 100% sure how to use this concept properly. What does it mean, and who coined that energy transition, that it is energy transition? Also, some of them, they're thinking, is this only related to the European Union, or it is related to United States, to China, to India? So can we please explain energy transition? What does it mean? Where does it come from? And how to use it properly?
So energy transition is another very broad concept, which, of course, it's not just a European idea. It is a global, and it should be a global concept. It relates to the urgency of tackling climate change. To tackle climate change, you need to transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a low-carbon economy. So some people say that, we hear at times like energy transition, green transition. Some people argue that low-carbon transition is the most accurate because it specifies even better that it is about abating greenhouse gas emissions. So again, like we focused a lot on the concept. It is a global concept, and we see other related terminology. For example, let's think of the Green Deal. In Europe, we have a European Green Deal to pursue the energy transition. In the US, the phrase is Green New Deal. But we are talking about similar things. In Korea, they have a Korean Green Deal, if I remember correctly. So it all relates to the idea of decreasing emissions to achieve zero net emissions or climate neutrality by a set date, which for Western economies, so the US, the EU overall, Korea and Japan, is usually around 2050.
We know that there are many regulations and directives in the EU related to the Green Deal, to the energy transition. But then we have one critical viewpoint, and that's it, that some argue that the EU energy policies and those of its members, they operate like parallel worlds. This CAM is doing that, those states are doing other things. So what measures could be taken to better harmonize these two parallel worlds or spheres of energy policies?
Yeah, well, negotiations and consensus are, not consensus, but achieving, let's say, at least a minimum common denominator is the way to proceed. So like I said, that the foundation, the legal foundation, but also the political foundation of these two parallel worlds are the EU treaties. Energy is an area of shared competence within the EU. It's specified in Article 4 and 194 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which has a formulation that talks about European energy goals and policies, but at the same time, member states retain the right to decide their energy mix. Of course, there are some constraints that have been agreed upon by member states themselves. You can decide your energy mix, but at the same time, member states agreed to decrease their greenhouse gas emissions to pursue certain targets. So, that energy mix, in any case, should include less and less coal, oil, and eventually also gas. And the choice is between, renewables, nuclear, if you want, what type of renewables you want to have. But at the same time, you're right to say that if we look at the table with the energy mix of member states, it looks like a mess. There's a lot of diversity. So the way to address this is to, while allowing for national specificities, which can also be, say, logical. Mediterranean member states have more solar power. Some countries like France and Sweden prefer to have nuclear over other energy sources, let's say. So within that, while considering these differences, European Council and the European institutions are the setting where member states sit down to negotiate common goals and also the mechanisms to regulate, to govern, those common goals and achieve them.
Do you think that sort of European Union Ministry of Energy would help, or would this be just another institution in the institutions of, or within the institutions of the European Union?
So the key question is, what powers would this minister have? The founding treaties, the current versions of the founding treaties state that energy is shared competence. So if you keep that in place and just create a new institutional figure, then not much is going to change. Like, with foreign policy, we have a high representative, but foreign policy is still largely a national prerogative. So, the new institution is not enough to change the political substance. And we can even say that to an extent, we had, we have a commission vice president for the European Green Deal. So some kind of, quite powerful institutional figure that plays a role. But having the member states on board would remain the key factor, regardless of the institutional position.
What do you think about renewables in the European Union as a tool that is changing the landscape or even the legislation of the European Union? Is this going to the right direction, so the quality of the legislation and the quality of implementation is better? Or do you think that since the announcement of the Green Deal, we are having sort of stable, not much progressive stance in the European Union?
So when it comes to legislation, we saw, say, an increase in speed, ambition as well, from the second half of the 2010s with the so-called winter package, when directives like on renewables, on energy efficiency were revised. And then the European Green Deal works within that framework. Some new legislative measures were added, but the basic framework has remained the same in evolution. And we do see progress if we look at the overall targets that have been set by this legislation. We see that there is an increase in ambition. At the same time, perhaps one of the weaker points of this edifice is the governance. We have a clear governance now. There is a governance regulation of the energy union. At the same time, it was decided that the governance is bottom up. Let's say it's member states doing the reporting, following, of course, precise deadlines. The Commission makes recommendations, comments on those progress reports. To simplify a little bit, however, there is no strict enforcement mechanism, and this is just a bit of speculation. At a time when there is strong consensus on energy, on a green transition, on climate policy, like such a relatively soft governance mechanism can work. But if the weather changes, so if we have a big economic crisis and the so-called green lash, so parts of the political establishment criticizing climate policy, it is possible that some member states just don't implement, and it's difficult to induce them and to force them to do so. But for now, if we consider the various economic difficulties, the geopolitical challenges, climate policy has retained a good degree of priority for now.
Right. One part of energy diplomacy of the European Union is that new initiative to buy energy supplies together. There are, a few platforms and they're trying to pursue that. What's your opinion about this approach and what sort of implications can you see?
Yeah, so it's a way to use Europe's market power as a large importer of, for example, gas. It's this idea that we find not just in the energy field, but using the size of the EUenergy market. Edinburgh-based scholar Chad Damroth talks about market power Europe. It can work to an extent, but it has several drawbacks. So one of them is that your partners, the sellers of energy, of course, won't like this kind of negotiation mechanism. And depending on the market circumstances, they might find also alternative export markets. For example, if we think of LNG, liquefied natural gas, now actually Europe had to accept quite high prices because the market has been tight for a while. The other, if not drawback, contradiction in a way, is that the idea of steering imports from the top, so aggregating the purchase of gas, having EU institutions or some EU bodies controlling or having an oversight on this, to an extent contradicts the free market logic that the European Union has been propagating for a while. So it has, it's not a solution to all evils, and in some cases it might even backfire depending on circumstances.
Right. Let's speak about the book that was published in 2023. The title is European Energy Politics, the Green Transition and the EU-Russia Energy Relations. So I got a couple of questions about this book, and one is that it appears that you focus quite a lot on RePowerEU as a concept. I would like to ask you why and what is your goal?
RePowerEU was the European Commission's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Within actually a matter of days, if we think of the first published draft of RePowerEU, it's from the 8th of March 2022. So within a few days, the European Union published this policy document, which made clear that now the EU aimed to cut considerably. I think that the initial document talked about 2/3 of gas imports. And So it became a bit of a mantra in the EU that this is the goal and it has to be achieved by diversifying fossil fuel imports away from Russia, increasing renewable production and energy efficiency. It was, and even in the subsequent version, the May 2022 version, it was a political document, or like setting political guidelines. And we can see this also in some of the short-term outcomes. It is difficult to imagine that the European Commission calculated all the possible market consequences that this would have within such a short period of time. At the same time, the logic of the document has remained the same, and the EU has been quite consistent in its call of at least decreasing for now substantially gas imports from Russia, and not to forget, of course, oil imports as well.
Many long-term contracts have been signed with Gazprom in European unions, and students are interested in what's going to happen with those contracts if they can't be fulfilled. Is the EU expecting like legal fights with Russian Gazprom, or how this matter is going to settle?
Yeah, this is it's a good question, and there's several aspects that also relate to they change depending on member states. So the contracts usually have a force majeure clause. So if something major and unexpected happens and the gas cannot be delivered, then, the exporter, for example, has a valid excuse, to put it simply. The destruction of Nord Stream, for example, could be seen as one such cause. Because the legal issues can come from either side, the legal action actually from both the importing countries and the exporter. So at the same time, it is possible that there will be legal consequences. The situation is quite complicated because a lot of this energy trade happened in euros and dollars, and the currencies were, again, we could say weaponized or politicized, but when the West started to enforce sanctions on Russia, froze Russian funds, then Russia didn't want to receive payments in a currency that, where the reserves could be frozen. So this is yet another issue that should be taken into account. Then Russia devised payment mechanism that, the West said it was about circumventing sanctions. Russia would say, no, it's because actually we want to receive the money and not, just fictitiously have it in some bank account and you freeze it. But this could also play a role, in the legal developments that we might see. It's quite a complex picture.
There is a chapter about EU-Russia energy relations in your book. And this is some of your specialty when you're researching EU-Russia relations. So can you please tell us a few words about this chapter?
So this chapter, it's actually chapter 6 in the book. It's quite closely related to chapter 7, which is about RePowerEU and what happened with the invasion of Ukraine. Chapter 6, so the first one, is a bit about the history of that energy relationship. So taking stock of over half a century of growing energy trade between then Soviet Russia and countries of the then Comecon in East Central Europe and Western European countries like West Germany, Italy, Austria, neutral Austria back then, which started to import Russian gas in the late 60s, early 70s. So the chapter reviews quite a bit of that literature that you mentioned, or at least some of the most prominent examples, and provides what is hopefully a handy summary of different views and developments with a focus on the latest developments. Different perspectives of member states on energy trade with Russia, which might even resurface. So it is a relatively succinct but hopefully comprehensive introduction to the topic, and then the students can of course expand on it by reading the literature that is referenced. For example, another recent book on the topic, or relatively recent, completed before the start of the war in 2022 in Ukraine, is Dan Gustafsson's Red Gas, which, it's more extensive read. So student that is not just writing an essay, but a thesis on the topic might want to read the details of how it all started in the 60s and what happened later.
You mentioned students, and there is a question from students about Green Deal. I know you have a chapter about Green Deal in your book, and the question is the conflict in Ukraine. Is it possible that that conflict might have implications that the Green Deal will speed up in the European Union?
Yeah, this was the idea of RePowerEU. We decrease dependence on Russian fossil fuels by accelerating the transition. So this is the logic. It's driven, of course, by the war in Ukraine, but also by climate change and worsening climate change. At the same time, the war can have different effects because while the European Union accelerates domestic energy transition, it is also looking for other exporters of fossil fuels. And to switch, for example, to import less pipeline gas from Russia, you need to import more liquefied natural gas. So you need import terminals for LNG, which not every country has. Germany, for example. This means putting more money into fossil fuel infrastructure, and importing LNG is not necessarily greener than importing pipeline gas. Actually, you find reports showing that if you import gas from far away, whether it's the US, for example, or Qatar, you also have to count, transportation, emissions related to transportation. Also, another side effect is that the EU, by using its market power, can offer maybe higher prices to LNG sellers that then start selling to the EU rather than to Latin America, for example. And Latin American markets, following on this example, that don't receive LNG could revert to coal. So you might, let's say, not increase emissions in Europe, but you have an increase in emissions elsewhere. And of course, the planet is one. So climate change is a global phenomenon.
I also think that it's important to mention the origin of LNG, because as we know, in the United States, there is that share of gas, fraction and mining. And there are so many documentaries how environment is suffering in the United States when they're doing that style of mining, that natural gas. So on one hand, we can say, oh, it's a clean or cleaner energy, but what's behind, it's also very important. When someone is writing a book, that's considerable amount of time. So what was your research methods, or how did you approach this or those topics? Because all of them, they are quite difficult topics. It's not a simple topic that you can write while you're drinking coffee. So let's shed some light on this, so we know how a researcher works in real life.
Yes. So first of all, the book is the result of several years, I would say almost 10 years of research. Some of the chapters appeared in earlier versions as journal articles or conference papers. And I received plenty of feedback. Feedback is very important to refine your ideas. Another important aspect was keeping an open mind about theoretical approaches, especially because, as I was saying at the beginning of this interview, the dominant logic in EU-Russia energy relations changed quite a lot during the timeline of the book. So multi-theoretical approach was important to understand why a liberal logic was dominant in the 2010s, and then it was eroded and even overturned to a good extent in 2022. So theoretical plurality, data, of course, is also very important. Reading numerous sources, differentiating academic sources from more political ones, and why not also comparing and contrasting different policy papers with different views. These are all useful aspects of this research.
I also deal with the Russian foreign policy, and I know that it's not always easy to get information about Russia or from Russia. And there are various reasons for that. It's not only politics, but there are also other reasons. How did you get information about Russia? And maybe if you can recommend a way of doing this for the junior researchers, for someone who want to write about Russia, but is not 100% sure how to get information about Russia.
No, this is a very good question also because circumstances have changed again during the last few years. I used to travel quite often to Russia until 2020 because COVID was the first, let's say, big obstacle to traveling to Russia, where I had contact with researchers. Reading their work was very, very useful. Accessing states, so official Russian officials, is very difficult, and now it's especially difficult. Possibly it's a bit easier to talk to representatives of the industry, so Gazprom and so on. But with the energy, we at least have the advantage that there are official data, and ultimately we refer to those. And this is, an important aspect of the actual, essential aspect of the actual energy trades. When it comes to public declarations, we can use tools such as discourse analysis, relate what policymakers say, with a constructivist approach to ideas and identities. So this is what we can do. We can work with what's available. What we maybe shouldn't do is speculate too much, because you find all sorts, as you know, you find all sorts of theories, conspiracy theories about Russia. We can't really know what's in Putin's head until he does something. It's even difficult to tell who he listens to. And for example, I'm not so sure that the heads of Gazprom, Rosatom, or fully of Rosneft were fully aware of what was going to happen in February 2022. And I'm quite sure that many of them were not so keen because it meant big strain on their companies.
The last questions for today's interview. When you write a book and when you research so many difficult topics like you do, the book answers so many questions, but also opens some more. maybe some new challenges for the research. So what would be your new research goals, or what sort of implications this book gave you for the research work?
Yeah, so if we stick to the topic, exploring the consequences of the decoupling, energy decoupling between Russia and the European Union is very interesting, not just for the European dimension, but for the effects on global markets. We see a reorientation of Russian exports to, let's call them rising powers, global south, China, and the reorientation of EU imports. So this is one thing. Then there are some aspects of the energy relationship that are, I admit, underexplored in the book and that are very relevant. For example, the nuclear sector. This is what I'm looking at now. Can we really talk about the nuclear sector in terms of dependence and vulnerability like we did for oil and gas? Well, actually, the trade of enriched uranium and nuclear fuel between Russia and EU countries that host Russian or Soviet nuclear technology is continued. So it didn't become so politicized as in the case of oil and gas. What are the differences? What is the role of Russia's nuclear diplomacy, which is actually mostly oriented towards non-Western countries? There's always some new questions to explore. What is Russia's role, also as a vast, the owner of vast resources that are useful for the energy transition? So let's say that as we move to new trade patterns and also to new constellations in the field of energy with the transition, there are new questions that come up. And the book is a snapshot with a specific focus between 2014 and 2020, early 2023. Now, where do we go from there?
Marco Siddi, thank you very much for your time, insightful thoughts about this very important topic, and also about your implications for junior researchers, how to research energy politics, European energy policies. It's a topic that is emerging, and I think we need more researchers to bring some information about not only what's going on, but what we should do for the future and how we should handle the green transition, new deals. Should we buy more LNG from the United States on one hand and support the green economy on the other hand, and also what to do with the Russian LNG coming to Europe? So there are many questions, and I think this interview answered many of them, but also portrayed or propose even more of them. So again, thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much, Martin, for all the questions and the interesting conversation.
Thank you, and see you next time.